When my grandparents passed, I inherited their house. It wasn't much to speak of, a small 2-story home nestled at the edge of a quiet forested town, but it had a charm to it, the kind you only find in places that have been lived in for decades. My mother wanted nothing to do with it. She'd left home at 18 and rarely looked back, saying there was too much history in those walls. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I do now. I moved in last spring, determined to make it my own. The house needed work, peeling paint, a leaky roof, creaking floorboards, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. For the first few weeks, I kept busy cleaning and fixing what I could. I painted the walls, replaced the locks, and even sorted through the boxes in the attic, unearthing relics of a life I barely knew. It wasn't until I settled in that I noticed the door. At first, I didn't think much of it. Houses settle, walls shift, and memory is a fickle thing. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it before. Tucked at the end of the hallway, its dull surface blending into the pale plaster. It wasn't worth a second thought. But that was before I realized it wasn't supposed to be there. The hallway had always been an unremarkable stretch of space, 3 doors evenly spaced along the wall. My room, the bathroom, the closet. It had been that way for as long as I could remember. But now there was a 4th, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the thought of it stuck in my mind like a splinter. The next time I passed it, I slowed, eyes drawn to the crack under its frame. There was no light bleeding through, no air stirring, but the space beneath the door seemed wrong, too narrow, too dark. I should have stopped. I should have stared it down, but something about it repelled me, like looking too long might invite it closer. I walked on, refusing to glance back, but even as I left it behind, I felt its presence settle in my chest, heavy and expectant. By the 3rd day, the door felt larger. It hadn't grown, I checked, glancing quickly as I passed, a stolen glance like a child avoiding something shameful. It was still the same size, the same dull wood, the same smudged brass knob, but it felt larger, like it took up more space than it physically occupied, like the hallway itself was bending around it. At night, I lay in bed and swore I could feel it there, a weight pressing against the edges of my mind. My dreams grew strange. Images of empty corridors, endless rows of doors that opened to nothing but more doors. I told myself it was just my imagination. Doors don't move, they don't watch. But when I woke up and stepped into the hallway, I found myself staring at it again, as if I'd been pulled there in my sleep. The door didn't belong. That was the thought that consumed me as I stood there one evening, frozen halfway down the hall. It was just a door, wood, hinges, a knob. Nothing about it should have felt threatening, but it didn't feel like something a person had made. It was too still, too deliberate, as though its very existence in my home was an act of will. Its surface looked too smooth in places, almost wet, while other parts seemed aged, warped, like it had been sitting there for decades. The closer I got, the more the texture seemed to shift, like the grain of the wood couldn't decide what it wanted to be. I backed away. The days stretched into a week, and the hallway became a gauntlet. Every time I passed, I told myself I wouldn't look at it, and every time I failed. My glances grew longer, lingering, as though the door were daring me to come closer. Its presence had a gravity to it, subtle but unyielding, pulling my thoughts back even when I was nowhere near the hallway. I stopped using the kitchen at night. I stopped leaving my room unless I had to. But it didn't help. The door was there in my mind. No matter where I went, a constant weight pressing against the edges of my thoughts. What was behind it? One night, I couldn't resist any longer. I found myself standing in the hallway, barefoot, the dim glow of the night light casting long shadows. The door was waiting, as it always was, but tonight it felt eager. I reached for the knob before I could stop myself. The brass was cool under my fingers, colder than it should have been, like it had been pulled from deep underground. I hesitated. My breath caught in my throat as the silence pressed against me, thick and unyielding. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked, and the sound seemed deafening, the only thing tethering me to reality. I turned the knob. The door swung inward with an almost imperceptible sigh, as though it had been holding its breath. At first, there was nothing, just a room. The air was stale, the kind of stillness that clings to spaces long forgotten. The walls were bare, the paint a dull off-white that might once have been bright but had long since faded. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly, though there was no breeze to move it. It wasn't the room itself that unsettled me, it was how ordinary it was. This was a place that didn't belong. Not in my house, not anywhere I could name. But it looked so normal it hurt. The angles of the wall seemed slightly off, the kind of imperfection you couldn't put your finger on but could feel in your gut. And in the center of the room, there was a chair. Plain wood, no cushions, no carvings, just a chair sitting in the middle of the room facing the doorway. Facing me. The light bulb flickered once, briefly, and for that instant, the room was swallowed by darkness. But it wasn't the kind of darkness that obscures, it was the kind that clarifies, stripping away the pretense of what things ought to be. In the absence of light, the walls rippled like living skin, the corners stretched outward into unseen distances, and the chair blurred, its edges softening into impossible curves, as though it wasn't in the room, but the room existed within it. Shadows crawled across the floor, curling around the chair's legs, shifting with whispered shapes. Arms, spines, things almost human but too alien to comfort. When the bulb flared back to life, the room snapped into its banal state. Bare walls, a plain chair, stagnant air. But the shadows lingered in my mind, burned into the edges of my vision, as if they had never truly left. The hallway is silent now. The door gone as though it had never been there, but I know better. It's waiting, somewhere, in the unseen corners of my home, and I fear that the next time I glance in its direction, I won't have the strength to turn away. For some context, when I was a kid, my grandmother always told me to avoid staircases at night. "They're bridges between worlds," she'd say, her voice low and grave as if she knew something no one else did. "When it's dark and the house is quiet, the stairs aren't yours anymore. They belong to something else." I laughed it off like any kid would. But when she passed, and I inherited her old, creaking house, I stopped laughing. The stairs in her home always felt strange. Too steep, too narrow. The wood slick under my feet as though it wanted me to slip. After I sold that house, I swore I'd never live in another old place. But when Lily showed me the Victorian on Elmwood Drive, I felt that old unease creep back up my spine. "It's perfect," she said, spinning in the foyer. Her smile was so wide, so full of hope, that I couldn't say no. The house loomed around us, its tall ceilings casting long, jagged shadows that moved even when nothing else did. Dust hung in the air like a fog, and the wallpaper peeled in long curling strips, revealing the splintered bones of the walls beneath. But it was the staircase that held me captive. It coiled up from the center of the house, an imposing spiral carved from some dark, oily wood. Its banister was smooth, gleaming unnaturally in the dim light, and the steps were impossibly deep, as if they'd been built for something larger than humans. When I stared at it too long, my vision blurred, and the staircase seemed to twist, the angles wrong, the shadows pooling in ways they shouldn't. I felt it then, a pressure, subtle but undeniable, like the house itself was aware of me, watching. "It's just a staircase," Lily said when I mentioned how unsettling it was. But even she couldn't hide the way her voice wavered just a little when she touched the banister. The first few nights were quiet, save for the usual creaks of an old house settling. Lily and I busied ourselves with cleaning and unpacking, but every time I passed the stairs, I felt their weight, their pull. It wasn't just their presence, it was the way they seemed to demand attention, to want something from me. The first time I heard the footsteps, I told myself it was Lily. It was after midnight, and I'd been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The sound was faint at first, a soft creak, then a pause, then another creak. The pattern was too deliberate, too steady to be random. I got up, my heart pounding, and stepped into the hallway. The stairs were empty. "Lily?" I whispered, my voice cracking. No answer. Just the oppressive silence of the house and the faint scent of wood polish that had started to cling to everything. I checked every room, but Lily was fast asleep in bed. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. On the first step was a faint impression, a footprint, but it wasn't mine or Lily's. It was long, inhumanly so, with too many toes that splayed outward like tree roots. The wood beneath it was warped, the grain rippling outward as though the step had softened under the weight of whatever had stood there. When I showed Lily, she laughed nervously. "It's just an old house," she said. "The wood's probably warped from moisture, or something." But that night she stared at the staircase longer than usual, her fingers grazing the banister. The noises grew worse. What started as faint creaks became loud, deliberate thuds, like something heavy dragging itself up the stairs. And then came the whispers, low and guttural, words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my chest, like vibrations reverberating through my ribs. And then there were the dreams. In them I was always at the base of the stairs, unable to move. The wood was no longer wood, but flesh, pulsating and veined, slick with something dark and wet. Faces swirled in the banister, their mouths opening and closing as they whispered to me in languages that twisted my mind. At the top of the stairs was a figure, tall and angular, its body wrong, too many joints bending the wrong way. Its eyes were deep pits of swirling black, and its grin stretched impossibly wide, splitting its face in two. When I woke, I could still feel the weight of its gaze. I thought it couldn't get worse, but then Lily changed. I found her one night standing on the stairs, her back to me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her neck twisted just slightly too far. "Lily?" I called. She turned slowly, her movements jerky, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Her face was hollow, her skin sagging as though it no longer fit her bones. Her eyes were black voids, and her lips were cracked and bleeding, stretched into a smile that wasn't hers. "They're beautiful," she whispered, her voice rasping like dry leaves. "What are?" I managed to choke out. "The stairs," she said. "They've been waiting for us." I tried to run that night, but the house wouldn't let me. Every door led back to the base of the staircase, its steps glistening wet and raw, the faces in the wood grinning at me with too many teeth. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't words anymore, but emotions, sensations, fear, hunger, longing. I fought for days, maybe weeks, refusing to climb those steps, but the house wore me down. The air grew heavier, suffocating, until it felt like my lungs were filled with tar. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't breathe without feeling the pull of the stairs. Last night, I stopped fighting. As I stepped onto the first step, the wood shifted beneath my feet, soft and warm like flesh. The faces in the banister writhed, their mouths stretching open in silent screams. With each step, my body felt lighter, less solid, as though the house was peeling me away from myself. My skin tingled, then burned, then softened, sinking into the stairs as if I were melting into them. By the time I reached the top, I was no longer myself. My arms had twisted, bending in impossible ways, my fingers merging into long, spindly appendages. My skin pulsed with the rhythm of the house, veins spreading like roots into the floor. And then I saw Lily. She was waiting for me, her body fused with the staircase, her face stretched across the banister, smiling. Her voice echoed in my mind, soft and sweet. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" And for the first time, I understood. The house doesn't take you. It welcomes you.